Hello, everybody. Today I have the pleasure to present the eDNA validation scale to you, which is a concept that helps you evaluate the performance of single species eDNA assays in regard to monitoring. It is the result of several years of work from combining people from different universities, but also bringing commercial providers into the picture. And the reason for doing it was very straightforward, because we have the scientific community and we all love applying our molecular tools to study eDNA. But within our community, there is always this feeling, hey, we could use this for more. This should be the future of species monitoring. So unsurprising, there's quite some fluctuation between the scientific side and commercial providers. What is still missing in the picture is the green light from legislators and the administration in general. And this is not surprising, because in order for this to happen, we need a certain framework and a level of standardization. And that's really difficult to reach with such a fast-moving field. The validation scale can be viewed as a first step in this direction. And I'll show you now two examples why this whole thing can be so useful. Here we have the great crested newt. It's the prime example for eDNA-based monitoring, because there are 7 publications, all based on the same assay, and everything that has been researched on this assay, on the base of this assay, has been put together, and it can be used for monitoring in the UK since 2014, and it is a formally recognized tool. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the signal crayfish, a species we also want to monitor in many regions. And we know it's possible with eDNA, but there are several publications on this topic, and they all use different assays, different protocols, different primers. So even though a lot of the work, like investigating seasonality, has been already done, it's very difficult to compare the results between the studies. And this makes a formal recognition difficult. Since 2017, people in the eDNA world have sat together and said, okay, let's try to make this happen. We start with single species assays because that's easier than meta-barcoding, and we want to include everything from field sampling to statistics. There was even a workshop dedicated solely to assay validation in 2018, and the result was a gigantic list of more than 100 variables. And we were able to put them all into a theoretical concept. But what followed then was the reality test. So the people you saw on the title slide, they validated almost 550 assays, filled the information in the checklist for every single one of them to make sure the validation scale matches what is going on in the real world and has a value and purpose and is not just a theoretical dream. The scale itself consists of 5 levels, from incomplete to operational. A basic assay only needs to be tested on tissue. For level 2, you need some sort of optimization. For level 3, a detection from an environmental sample is necessary. For level 4, you need to deal with the level of limit of detection, and level 5 means that you have to work on detection probability estimates. This is a simplified version of what's going on, but what I want to talk about now is the interpretation of results, not in the context of an individual study, but generally. What would happen if you took a sample in a certain way at an unknown location and analyzed it in a certain way as described in an assay? At level 1 and 2, your results would be inconclusive. You cannot say what's going on in the real world. At level 3, you have a good chance that detections are trustworthy. And only on levels 4 and 5 do the results likely reflect the real world situation. We had one big problem, let's call it, in this whole process. The 104 variables needed to be assigned to the 5 levels. And we did this by sorting them into 14 variable blocks, like in silico testing or DNA extraction. And then we saw that each of these blocks, it was easy to assign them to a certain level, but each of them contained variables where we thought, well, I think many people report that. And in the same block, you had variables where you were thinking, hardly everybody talks about that. That's not a common thing to consider. So what we needed was a minimum amount of validation to show that a certain in silico analysis was done, that the assay could go on to a higher level. That's why we introduced minimum criteria. For instance, at level 3, for concentration of eDNA from an environmental sample, you need to report the filter type or precipitation chemicals. So please note that all of these are very common things. We didn't want to force people to report things like filtration pressure, which is currently not often addressed in our publications. That was a lot of theory and also a lot of tables. How about I show you some of the really exciting results we obtained with our data set. The majority of the assays targeted fish species. On second place, there are amphibians. Most of them can be only found in one publication, so building upon other people's work is not very common in our field. The majority of assays used qPCR or standard PCR for amplification. Regarding the reporting frequency of individual variables, the picture looks like this. So here you can see all the individual variables, each one is a column, and they are all assigned to their respective level on the validation scale. And down here is 100% reporting, and up here is 0% reporting. What you can see is that at each level you have assays that are frequently variables that are frequently reported or tested, and others that are hardly ever addressed. This is a nice justification for us to include the minimum criteria. And the other thing that you can see here is that the maximum percentage certain variables are reported is often close to 100% at lower levels. But the higher you go up on the scale, the lower does this percentage get. And at level 5, many variables are only reported in 25% of all the cases in our database. Now I'd like to show you what I call the efficient and the unlucky assays. Here on this graph, you can see the validation level of each assay, and on the y-axis, the percentage of variables that were reported. First, there is a group of assays that reported between 20 and 60% of all variables, but did not fulfill the minimum criteria to reach level 1. They didn't make it onto the scale. Also, there is no yellow violin. None of our assays made it to level 5, which means we as a community definitely need to get better at reporting what we're testing and doing. On the bottom of the violins, you can see the, quote, efficient assays. These don't report many variables, but the ones that are reported are deemed important, at least by our group in the validation world. On top of the violins, you can see assays that contain a lot of information, but a certain key piece must have been missing, otherwise these should have been on a higher level on the scale. Things I want you to keep in mind from all of this are, there is a difference between tests that are not done and not reported. And Only an author of the publication can easily distinguish between the two. Report as much as you can. Feel free to use our checklist as basis for your own publications. And also communicate and connect. That's the only way to obtain additional information. Also keep in mind, nobody is perfect. Don't expect your own assays or the assays of other people to reach 100% in all variable blocks. We as a field are simply not there yet, but I think we should make an effort to reach this goal. And finally, keep in mind that an assay is not automatically bad, but it's very likely it's just unsuitable for what you want to do with it. And now I'd like to end my presentation with a call for help. All that you saw until now is based on assays that were published before 2019. Assays published after April 2019 are not validated yet, and you can go to edna-validation.com where you can see the scale, the literature database, and individual scores, and you can also find a submission page. So if you're a master or a PhD student, feel free to support us in our effort to validate the new assays. You can also contact us under this email address. All this work will soon be published. It's currently in press at the Journal of Environmental DNA. And I'd like to thank you now for your attention. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask me now or contact me or the other authors on Twitter or send us an email. Thank you very much for listening.